Sometimes those don't work so well. Okay, we're going to try this. This works? Okay, good. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. So you all have a sheet, but before we get to the sheet, I need to explain why we're doing this. So we had two Torahs today because we had to read a section from Deuteronomy that talks about Amalek. Everybody read that, yeah? So we always read that section right before Purim. Did Rabbi Strauss tell you why? Anybody here know why we read about Amalek right before Purim? Haman is a descendant of Amalek, right. So how do we know that Haman is a descendant of Amalek? So that comes from the Haftarah, which we also read today. So let me start with Deuteronomy. So in Deuteronomy, Moses reminds the Israelites, we had to fight these Amalekites. They were attacking us from the rear. They were attacking the women and the children and the infirm, the sick, the people who couldn't defend themselves. But we defeated them, but we didn't wipe them out. And so God said, I want you to remember to wipe out Amalek. Remember to forget them. It's funny kind of a commandment. And so it's a command that Moses repeats in Deuteronomy. When the Israelites get their first king, King Saul, the prophet Samuel turns to the king and says, okay, Saul, you remember we were commanded to destroy the Amalekites. Now that you're king of all Israel, your job now, your mission, should you decide to accept it, is to go out and destroy the Amalekites. This tape will self-destruct in 10 seconds. Anybody remember that? All right. Anyways, your mission is to go out and destroy the Amalekites. And so King Saul says, yes, sir. And he goes out and they go to battle and they wipe out the Amalekites, except he doesn't wipe everything out. And it's actually in the Haftarah that we read today. He spares the king, among other things. And the king's name, did anybody catch the name of the king? Agag. Yeah, his name is Agag. And Samuel hears that Saul didn't follow instructions. He's very furious on God's behalf. He says, how come you didn't follow God's instructions? And Saul said, I did. And he said, well, how come the king is still here? And it's not clear, by the way, why he spared the king. Maybe there's a sort of ancient warfare. Does anybody know, like, kings have a deal, we don't kill each other? I don't know. Anyway, he didn't kill the king. So Samuel says, bring him out here. And he's got his sword in his scabbard. It's very dramatic. I hope you read it. It was a lot of fun. I think it is. King Agag comes out. He sees Samuel with the sword in his scabbard, and he says to him, literally, this is what he says, bitter death is at hand. It's like Shakespeare wrote that or something. Anyway, so then Samuel takes out his sword, and he says, just as your sword has bereaved many women, in other words, there's a lot of widows out here because you killed a bunch of men. Your mother is going to be bereaved, right? And then he strikes Agag down. But the tradition is that Agag, before he died, had a child. And the way we know that is because when you get to the book of Esther that we're going to read Monday night, when Haman is introduced in the book of Esther, he is called Haman Ha'agagi. That's the Hebrew. And in English, we say Haman the Agagite. So the ite ending is Latin for son of, right? Which means Haman is the son of Agag. And Agag was the king of the Amalekites. Not son of, but he's a descendant of, many generations later, of Agag. So that's how we know that Haman is an Amalekite. By the way, when the king Saul is introduced in the book of Samuel, King Saul is introduced as a man from the tribe of Benjamin, the son of a guy named Kish, like the cheese pie, only not really the cheese pie. Anyway, he's the son of Kish from the tribe of Benjamin. And, you know, sometimes we don't pay attention to these genealogies, but when Mordecai is introduced in the book of Esther, Mordecai is introduced as a descendant of a guy named Kish from the tribe of Benjamin, right? So what we have in the book of Esther is this intergenerational battle of good against evil, the Israelites against the Amalekites. And that is the reason why we read this passage on right before the holiday of Purim to remind us to wipe out the Amalekites. And by the way, I didn't mention this to the chapel people, so they don't know this. They probably do, actually. But why do we make noise every time we say Haman's name? Because we're supposed to wipe out the name of Amalek, right? So when we say Haman's name, we're literally wiping him out by blotting it out, by shouting over his name. Also because it's fun, and because in the ancient movies, when they were silent movies, the bad guy came out on the film, everybody would go boo, right? And then the good guy would come out and say yay, right? So we're having a good time, so that's another reason. Anyway, now that we've talked about that, one of the important thing about the book of Esther is God's name isn't mentioned. God doesn't seem to be active in the book of Esther at all. So now that we know that God isn't involved directly in the story, maybe he's behind the scenes, we can read this first text. So at the scene at Mount Sinai, the Israelites are standing at the base of the mountain, and there's thunder and there's lightning and the earth is shaking, and they hear the commandments. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall have no other gods besides me. And then everybody turns to Moses and says, Moses, Moses, we're terrified. This is too much. The earth is shaking. There's thunder, lightning. The voice is too terrifying. Go up the mountain, talk to God, come back and tell us what he says. So the people were terrified. And the rabbis, based on that idea, they tell the story. They stood under the mountain. In the Hebrew, I put the Hebrew there, chapter 19, verse 17, Vayitzavu b'tachtita har, which probably really means they were standing at the base of the mountain. But for our purposes, Rav Abdimi ben Chama ben Chassa said they were standing under the mountain. How do you do that? Because God lifted the mountain up and held it over their heads. And then he said, do you accept my commandments? Great. Otherwise, I'm going to drop this thing on your heads and you'll be buried here. Right? They were terrified. And so then Rav Acha ben Jacob says, well, that is a strong protest against the Torah. How many people are here are attorneys? Anybody here an attorney? Well, besides me. Anyway, okay, so one of the things you learn first-year contracts law is if somebody puts a gun to your head and says, sign here, you can say, I signed this contract under duress. It's voidable. You can get out of the contract. Right? So God is putting a gun to their head and saying, do you accept this contract? And so Rav Acha ben Jacob says, we entered into this contract under duress. Maybe we should just skip it. Forget about it. We'll go do other things. So Rabbah says, not so fast. And he says, in the days of Ahasuerus it is written, the Jews confirmed and took upon themselves, that's verse chapter 9, verse 27, the Jews ordained and took upon them and upon their children, that's us, and upon all those who joined themselves to them, they would not fail that they would keep these 2 days of Purim according to their writing, according to their appointed time every year. So he says, see, they confirmed that they were going to celebrate the holiday of Purim, and since God's presence wasn't immediately felt in the story of Esther, there's no duress. They did this willingly. They said, hey, we want to celebrate this holiday. So you might say to me, Rabbi, that only means Purim, right? We'll do Purim, forget Yom Kippur. We like celebrating, forget fasting. We're not going to do Shabbos, we'll go out to the store, whatever. Forget everything else. We're just going to do Purim. No, that's not what his point is. His point is, if you accept Purim, why are you doing Purim? Because you believe there's a God who commanded us, who gave us rules to live by. If you accept Purim, you have to accept everything that came before Purim, all the way back to Moses. So you're accepting the whole package. And we did it willingly, and we took it upon ourselves and our children. So that's the first thing that we learn about that. So what do we do on Purim? That's from chapter 9, verse 20. Mordecai wrote these things, sent letters to all the Jews in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, that they should keep the 14th day of the month of Adar, the 15th if it's a walled city, as the days wherein the Jews rested from their enemies, the month which was turned from sorrow to joy, from mourning to good day, that they should make a feast, days of feasting. So the first thing we have to do on Purim is have a feast, eat a big meal. Usually this is done in the afternoon, so it would be Tuesday afternoon, not Monday night when we read the Megillah, but sometime during the day on Tuesday, you have a big feast of a meal. When I was a lawyer, I didn't usually eat out for lunch because, first of all, I kept kosher and there wasn't a lot of places I could eat. And eating fish every time was boring after a while. So I would just pack peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and eat them in my office. But on Purim, I made sure to go out to a nice restaurant because I'm supposed to feast on Purim. Anyway, whatever you want to do. you're supposed to have a big feast. And you would send portions. That's shalach manot, right? That's where you get the idea of sending cookies and candy and cake. And if you want to be healthy, you can send fruits and vegetables. I don't know if your friends will like you after that, but you can do it anyways. Send fruits and vegetables. Here, have something healthy on Purim. Or you can do the chocolate. I prefer chocolate. Anyway, you're supposed to send gifts to friends, make them so they can have a happy day. And you're supposed to give gifts to the poor so they can celebrate too. So make a donation to the food bank or to Search or some other organization so that the poor people can celebrate also. Those are the main commandments for Purim, except one more thing: you're supposed to read the book. So we read the book of Esther Monday night, and if you're very diligent, you can read it again Tuesday morning at 6:45 in our chapel. The last thing I want to talk about is drinking. It's become a custom to drink on Purim. And that idea comes actually from the Talmud. So we're going to read the story in the Talmud. The Talmud says, it's from the tractate of Megillah, which is about Purim. Rabbi said it's the duty of a person to get drunk with wine or other intoxicating beverages, hopefully legal ones. You can get drunk on wine on Purim until he can't tell the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. Now, I have to tell you, I am the only rabbi in the world, I think, who reads this passage this way. Still looking for another rabbi to agree with me. People seem to read it as you can't tell the difference between the good guy and the bad guy, between Mordechai and Haman. That's pretty tough not to be able to know the difference between them. I mean, the good guy's always wearing white, the bad guy's always wearing black. It should be pretty simple. But that's not exactly what it says. It says you're not supposed to tell the difference between blessed is Mordechai and cursed is Haman. In other words, you don't know the difference between which is better, to bless the hero or to curse the enemy. That's not as big a difference as having to know the difference between the good guy and the bad guy. Anyway, I'm the only one who reads it that way. But you're supposed to get drunk so you don't know the difference. And then there's going to tell a story. When I was at Hartman Institute, they taught me one thing. They taught me a lot of things. But one thing was, when you read a general rule in the Talmud, and then they tell you a story, the story undermines the rule. So they told you to get drunk. Now let's look at the story. Rabbi and Rav Zera joined together for a Purim feast, and they got drunk. And Rabbi got up and killed his friend Rav Zera. The next day, he prayed on his behalf. Right? He wakes up from his drunken stupor and sees his friend dead, and he prays to God for a miracle. And a miracle happens, and Rav Zera comes back to life. This is how you know it's only a story. This doesn't happen in the real world. But this is the story they're telling, right? So he killed his friend comes back to life. Next year, Rabbi says to his friend, "Hey, you want to come and have a Purim festival with me?" And his friend says, "Are you out of your mind?" No, he doesn't say. He says, "A miracle doesn't happen every year," right? Last year, you killed me. Miraculously, I came back to life. I'm not counting on a miracle happening this year. Forget it. I'll go somewhere else for a party. So what the Talmud is telling you is, don't get drunk, right? You should have a little bit to drink so you're happy and in a good mood because we're supposed to celebrate the festival of Purim. But don't get so drunk you don't know what you're doing. You could stumble and fall and do something really embarrassing and whatever. I know there are some people out there, I won't name names, who do that on Purim. But actually, all the legal authorities say that's not what you're supposed to do. You should have a little bit to drink so you're in a happy mood. Maimonides even says, just have a little bit so you fall asleep. And when you're asleep, you don't know the difference between Mordechai and Haman. So have a little something to drink, but don't get drunk. Today, by the way, if you go to a Purim festival and you get drunk and you drove there, you literally could kill somebody. Right? Somebody said you should get an Uber, which, okay. But anyway, so be careful when you're driving. Okay, so the rules are, have a happy Purim, remember Amalek, let's wipe out evil, let's make everybody into good people, and enjoy the festival of Purim, and remember Amalek. Shabbat Shalom.
All right, thank you, Rabbi Morgen, and getting us ready.